Estimadas personas, estudiantes, académicos, académicas, excelentísimo señor Alberto Colella, embajador de Italia en Costa Rica, estimados estudiantes pasantes, invitadas e invitados especiales, autoridades y personal administrativo de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales y de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales, tengan todas y todos ustedes muy buenas noches. Extendemos un cordial saludo también a todas las personas que nos siguen en línea por el Facebook Live del Auditorio Clodomiro, Picado, y vía Facebook de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales. Señoras y señores, la Universidad Nacional, la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales, la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales les ofrecen la más cordial bienvenida a la lección inaugural del ciclo lectivo 2023 de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales, en el marco del 50 aniversario de su fundación y también recordar que estamos celebrando el 50 aniversario de la fundación de nuestra Casa de Estudios, la Universidad Nacional. Nos honran con su presencia en la mesa principal el señor Jorge Herrera Murillo, vicerrector de investigación, la señora Marta Sánchez López, decana de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales, el señor Marco Vinicio Méndez Coto, director de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales, y el señor Lorenzo Peregrini, conferencista invitado. Las palabras de bienvenida de la lección inaugural de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales del ciclo lectivo 2023 nos lo ofrece el señor Marco Vinicio Méndez Coto, director de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales.
Buenas noches. Doctor Jorge Herrera Murillo, vicerrector de investigación. Doctora Marta Sánchez López, decana de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales. Doctor Lorenzo Pellegrini, nuestro conferencista invitado. Señor embajador Alberto Colella, embajador de Italia en Costa Rica, nuestro invitado especial. Queridas profesores, profesoras, estimados estudiantes y a todas las personas que nos acompañan por las redes sociales, sean muy bienvenidos a este acto de inauguración del primer ciclo del año 2023. En los últimos años, los temas ambientales se han consolidado en la agenda internacional, en particular como una preocupación de la alta política que en el pasado se enfocó solo en lo militar. En años recientes, lo ambiental en sus diferentes dimensiones ha llamado la atención de los estados y sus gobiernos, en primera instancia, por lo que significa para su supervivencia más fundamental, por ejemplo, su seguridad nacional en materia de integridad territorial, aunque también, al ir más allá de aproximaciones como la seguridad nacional, lo ambiental ha mostrado consecuencias desde la seguridad humana, es decir, el bienestar en términos económicos, políticos, sociales y ambientales de las personas. Temas vinculados con la presión excesiva sobre los recursos naturales, eventos climáticos extremos y más frecuentes, la crisis por los recursos hídricos, los efectos del cambio climático, entre otros, son temáticas más comunes en los grandes foros internacionales y su presencia en los medios de comunicación es más que evidente. La discusión de estos tópicos excede los foros especializados y es un reto crítico en los esfuerzos por comunicar efectivamente la ciencia, tanto a la sociedad en general como a quienes formulan y ejecutan políticas públicas, reto que no exime a las universidades. A pesar de que la temática ambiental ha sido protagonista en los círculos mediáticos y políticos internacionales de los últimos años, dos sucesos de data reciente parecieran que inciden en su desplazamiento: la pandemia por el COVID-19 y la guerra entre Rusia y Ucrania. El fenómeno de la pandemia, dada su multidimensionalidad y facilidad para extenderse, implicó retos para la gestión pública de la mayoría de los países del mundo, junto con las consecuencias económicas que implicó el cierre de fronteras, por ejemplo, en un mundo altamente conectado en lo físico y lo virtual. Pareciera que por un corto tiempo nuestro planeta tuvo un respiro y se registró una disminución en las emisiones de dióxido de carbono. No obstante, la eventual apertura de fronteras, conforme los países avanzaron en sus procesos de vacunación, han incidido en las posibilidades de retomar patrones de consumo, incluso con mayor fuerza, propios de la época prepandemia. En este proceso de reapertura pandémica, la guerra entre Rusia y Ucrania, que inició cerca de un año atrás, ha evidenciado una vez más la complejidad de los fenómenos geopolíticos localizados en una región, pero con efectos multidimensionales y transnacionales, tal cual ha sido la incidencia en los precios de alimentos y materias primas, incluyendo los hidrocarburos, sin dejar de lado la crisis humanitaria que ha representado dicho conflicto. En este contexto de enfrentamientos geopolíticos y urgencia de lo ambiental, es imperativo resaltar el rol de nuestro país. Costa Rica ha ocupado una posición histórica como referente ambiental y más recientemente como líder en materia de cambio climático. Grandes victorias como la creación de áreas protegidas extendidas por todo el territorio nacional, así como el establecimiento de sistemas novedosos de gobernanza para el manejo de dichas áreas, la moratoria de la minería de cielo abierto, el pago por servicios ambientales, la posibilidad de contar con una matriz energética limpia y sus novedosas propuestas orientadas a la descarbonización de la economía le han brindado un lugar de prestigio en el mundo. No obstante, en un espíritu de mejora y autocrítica que siempre nos debe caracterizar como universidad, es importante también señalar aquellas deudas pendientes vinculadas con la matriz de transporte altamente dominada por vehículos que dependen de los hidrocarburos, el manejo de desechos sólidos y aguas residuales, el efectivo uso del agua potable, retos para implementar políticas integrales en materia de adaptación al cambio climático y la sostenibilidad de nuestros mares con justicia social son parte de las grandes discusiones pendientes que tenemos como sociedad y donde lo científico y lo político deben encontrar convergencias. Es aquí donde las instituciones de educación superior, como instancias formadoras de extensión e investigación, deben asumir un rol protagónico con abordajes novedosos y participativos de los retos ambientales. En este contexto, nuestra escuela se ha caracterizado por el análisis del ambiente como parte de la realidad internacional, con el claro compromiso de que dichos abordajes se realicen con aproximaciones creativas, rigurosas, interdisciplinarias, desde la complejidad y la diversidad que caracteriza los sistemas sociales y ambientales. Lo anterior a partir de una lectura crítica y detallada de los principales tópicos que ocupan la agenda internacional. De allí nuestro interés por abrir espacios como esta conferencia inaugural sobre las grandes discusiones que caracterizan las políticas ambientales internacionales con un invitado distinguido como el doctor Lorenzo Pellegrini. Doctor Pellegrini, bienvenido a Costa Rica, bienvenido a nuestra Universidad Nacional. Después de 20 años que no visitaba el país, primera vez en nuestra casa de enseñanza, agradecemos sinceramente el interés de compartir sus reflexiones y experiencias sobre la política ambiental internacional. Confío que este espacio, así como las demás oportunidades que compartiremos durante esta semana, enriquecerán el quehacer de nuestra unidad académica y la reflexión sobre lo ambiental en la escena internacional. Una calurosa bienvenida para todas las personas que nos acompañan.
Nos ofrece su mensaje la doctora Marta Sánchez López, decana de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales.
Muy buenas noches a todas y todos. Siempre es un placer saludarles, saludar a estudiantes, porque esta es la razón de ser de la universidad. Un saludo muy caluroso a cada una y cada uno de ustedes que tal vez hoy o en las 2 semanas anteriores han tenido la posibilidad del encuentro, del reencuentro aquí en la universidad, y esto es absolutamente valioso. Entonces créanme que para mí solamente saber que ustedes están aquí ya se cumplió el objetivo de la lección como tal. Saludo muy afectuosamente a don Marco Méndez, compañero de la facultad, director de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales, a don Jorge Herrera, queridísimo compañero vicerrector de investigación, a don Lorenzo Pellegrini, quien tengo escasos minutos de conocerle, pero que creo que estábamos hablando del impacto que ha sido tener lluvias torrenciales en pleno verano, ¿verdad? Que estamos extrañando, nos sentimos como en el mejor de los inviernos. Un saludo muy especial al señor embajador que nos visita y que dice que ha estado participando de las fiestas aquí de la universidad, bienvenido. Y un saludo también muy especial a quienes hacen posible que ustedes están aquí, que son sus profesores y profesoras. Ubico algunos por allá, saludé por ejemplo a Gaby, saludé a Hugo, creo que ahí está don Juan Carlos, doña Marlen, que dicha que está por aquí, Roy, María Fernanda, Carlos, Gerald y Hugo, por supuesto, y las compañeras Gabriela, y me disculpo si algunos otros nombres no los ubico, pero espero saludarlos ahora al final. Quiero rescatar otra vez la dinámica del encuentro. Siempre se nos invita, y creo que es muy importante, el hecho de que las lecciones inaugurales de todos los ciclos lectivos, escucharán ustedes que hay múltiples ofertas, no solamente por la lección inaugural que hace la universidad en sí, sino las que cada unidad académica planea, planifica, para que ustedes tengan la dicha, y digo la dicha, porque muchas veces la bibliografía nos presenta algún docente a leer, algún profesor a quien leemos o admiramos, y muchas veces no tenemos la oportunidad de tener un tú a tú, de decir posteriormente, yo lo conocí, yo lo escuché. Entonces, espero que saquen provecho de esta actividad y de toda la oferta que la universidad brinda para ustedes. Quisiera referirme muy brevemente al acontecimiento del que somos objeto el día de hoy. Hoy, 14 de marzo, hace 50 años, la universidad abrió sus puertas a la comunidad nacional. La Universidad Nacional, 50 años después, es una universidad muy joven para algunos y algunas, ¿verdad?, que podríamos tener de referencia. Sin embargo, en esta madurez que hemos alcanzado como una chiquilla de 50, podríamos decir, tenemos el orgullo nosotros también de ser parte de la facultad más grande de esta universidad. Nosotros que estamos acá pertenecemos a la comunidad más grande de estudiantes, que son alrededor de 5.800 estudiantes de las 10 unidades académicas que son parte de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales. Tenemos 8 unidades académicas y 2 institutos de investigación. En los temas más diversos, en los temas que justo ayer, en este mismo recinto, aprobamos 6 grandes áreas de conocimiento que versan entre el patrimonio y la cultura, entre la transformación social, en la teoría y metodología, la epistemología y otros saberes en ciencias sociales, la internacionalización, que versa sobre la sostenibilidad y cómo también hacemos que nuestro conocimiento llegue a ser parte de la política y gestión de la política pública como tal. Entonces, quienes están aquí tenemos una gran responsabilidad, y ustedes, al ser parte de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales, con mucha más razón, porque son las personas que en un futuro, en unos 10 años plazo son los que van a estar dictando las políticas, no solo nacionales y ojalá internacionales, de la formación que aquí se les ofrece. Quiero felicitar también a la escuela, quien hoy cumple 50 años. Este año es de celebraciones, estamos en puras celebraciones y ojalá que todos ustedes se sumen a todo lo que con mucho cariño y con mucho esmero se ha planificado para que esta gran fiesta, que significa ser parte de la universidad, ser parte de la Universidad Pública de Costa Rica, ustedes la lleven en sus venas. La tarea aquí es disentir, la tarea aquí es discernir, la tarea aquí es resistir. Estamos en un momento en que la universidad pública está en peligro. No en peligro porque esto se oye en los años anteriores de que estamos marchando en las calles por presupuesto para la universidad. Está en peligro hoy porque muchos de ustedes que son los privilegiados en estar aquí saben que muchos de sus comunidades, familiares, amigos, compas del cole no están aquí en la universidad teniendo el privilegio que tienen ustedes. Un saludo muy especial. Feliz aniversario a la escuela, feliz aniversario a la universidad y disfruten de todo lo que les ofrece la vida universitaria. Muchísimas gracias y parabienes a todos.
Nos ofrece su mensaje el señor Jorge Herrera Murillo, vicerrector de investigación de la Universidad Nacional.
Muy buenas noches a todos y todas. Un especial saludo al excelentísimo señor Alberto Colella, embajador de Italia en Costa Rica, a la doctora Marta Sánchez López, decana de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales, al doctor Marco Vinicio Méndez Coto, director de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales, al doctor Raúl Fonseca, subdirector de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales, al distinguido conferencista de esta noche, el doctor Lorenzo Pellegrini, profesor del Instituto Internacional de Estudios Sociales, y en general a todo el personal académico, administrativo y al distinguido estudiantado de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales. Quisiera el día de hoy apuntar 5 cosas que considero claves con respecto a la temática que se va a desarrollar el día de hoy en la conferencia. La primera de ellas es que tenemos que reconocer que si estudiamos la historia de la Tierra, nos vamos a dar cuenta que el cambio climático no es algo novedoso. Ya de forma natural, la Tierra ha venido experimentando periodos de enfriamiento y de calentamiento en ciclos. Y esos ciclos se deben no solo a factores externos, sino también a factores internos. Por ejemplo, la Tierra tiene un ángulo de rotación de 23.5 grados, un eje, y este ángulo del eje de rotación se va haciendo más grande o más pequeño por ciclos. Lo que pasa es que ese cambio climático de origen natural le toma al planeta periodos de miles de años. Como segundo punto que quisiera resaltar es el hecho de que el cambio climático del que estamos preocupados como sociedad en este momento es un cambio climático antropogénico, causado por el hombre, que es muy diferente al cambio climático natural, producto de el eje de rotación y la trayectoria que el planeta tiene alrededor del Sol. Y ese cambio climático de origen antropogénico está ocurriendo a partir del año 1960 en adelante. Y sobre todo se debe a que las concentraciones de gases efecto invernadero en la atmósfera están aumentando y lo están haciendo a una velocidad muy rápida. Estos gases tienen la particularidad de que dejan pasar la radiación del Sol hacia el planeta, pero cuando esta radiación choca contra la superficie del planeta pierde energía y una vez que se devuelve al espacio lo hace con una condición que gases como el dióxido de carbono, el metano y el óxido nitroso no la dejan salir al espacio, de forma tal que el planeta se está calentando. Este calentamiento, entonces, está directamente relacionado a la concentración de gases de efecto invernadero que haya en la atmósfera. Eso quiere decir que si como habitantes de este planeta nosotros no hacemos acciones contundentes por controlar las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero, el calentamiento global no se va a detener. Los esfuerzos en materia de política internacional han estado concentrados precisamente en que los países a nivel internacional logren estabilizar sus emisiones, o sea, hacer que esas emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero no sigan creciendo. En este momento, lo que estamos tratando de evitar es que el incremento en la temperatura del planeta, producto del calentamiento global, sea mayor de 3 grados Celsius. Porque a partir de 3 grados Celsius, las consecuencias serían catastróficas para la vida como la conocemos sobre el planeta. Entonces, estabilizar las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero pasa por controlar el uso de combustibles fósiles, que son tal vez la principal fuente de gases de efecto invernadero, específicamente del dióxido de carbono. Y sobre todo tenemos que entender que si no logramos estabilizar esa concentración y si no logramos reducir el incremento en la temperatura media del planeta, vamos a tener efectos adversos, como ya lo estamos viendo, de derretimiento de los cascos polares, de incremento en el nivel del mar y muchas otras implicaciones a nivel de pérdida de especies en ecosistemas, a través de la aparición de enfermedades en lugares donde no sería natural esperarlas, e inclusive efectos en productividad y en la parte de agricultura. Y ni qué decir de las movilizaciones humanas que podría generar el cambio climático, por ejemplo, por el desaparecimiento o la desaparición, perdón, de playas en sitios costeros. Indiscutiblemente, cuando hablamos de cambio climático, tenemos que reconocer que estamos ante un fenómeno que más bien corresponde a un cambio global, en el sentido de que a pesar de que el cambio climático pareciera un fenómeno muy circunscrito a la ciencia, es un fenómeno que tiene repercusiones a nivel político, económico y social. Sin duda, el reemplazo de combustibles fósiles por tecnologías limpias es una vía fundamental para poder reducir las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero. Por ejemplo, en el caso del país, nuestra matriz energética es básicamente en un 98.5% constituida por fuentes renovables. Pero no nos equivoquemos, esa es la matriz energética, eléctrica. Una diferencia muy grande es la matriz energética total del país, que incluye el uso de combustibles fósiles para transporte, que en el caso del inventario de gases de efecto invernadero de nuestro país constituye alrededor de un 60%. Y es que tenemos que tener claro que el trabajar en modificar nuestra matriz energética es un elemento fundamental para tener una contribución como país al fenómeno del cambio climático. Me permito indicarles que América Latina en su totalidad, desde México a Argentina, representa nada más un 5% de las emisiones totales de gases de efecto invernadero. O sea, perfectamente podríamos dejar de producir gases de efecto invernadero en América Latina si tener un efecto real en los problemas de calentamiento global. Son potencias internacionales como Estados Unidos o como China las que tienen la respuesta en la mano, sobre todo en temas de reducción de gases de efecto invernadero y adopción de tecnologías. Y eso hace que este tema se traslade precisamente al ámbito de ejercicio que ustedes como profesionales van a tener en el área de relaciones internacionales, porque al final la solución al cambio climático va a pasar por el establecimiento de acuerdos internacionales a nivel de política que permita llegar realmente a una estabilización de las emisiones y evitar los peores escenarios de incremento de emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero. Desde el Consejo de Rectoría y la Vicerrectoría de Investigación felicitamos a la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales por la pertinencia del tema seleccionado, por poner a la discusión de los estudiantes y el personal académico y administrativo de la escuela este tema que sin duda plantea un reto fundamental para la sostenibilidad del planeta en los próximos años. Les deseo a cada uno de ustedes el mejor aprovechamiento de esta conferencia. Muchísimas gracias y buenas noches.
Con las palabras de las autoridades de la mesa principal, declaramos oficialmente inaugurado el ciclo lectivo de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales 2023. El acto cultural de esta actividad, previo a la conferencia de fondo a cargo del doctor Lorenzo Peregrini, está a cargo del estudiante Luis Jesús Mejía Cruz, quien es un joven pianista hondureño, estudiante de la Escuela de Música de la Universidad Nacional de Costa Rica. Actualmente estudia el bachillerato, ha ganado premios y reconocimientos tanto en Honduras como en Costa Rica. En Costa Rica ha interpretado como solista con la Orquesta de Costa Rica Piano Festival y en la Orquesta de la UCR. Ha tocado como solista en el Teatro Nacional de Costa Rica en el año 2022. También recibió el tercer premio de la sexta categoría como pianista solista en el Festival Concurso Villa Hermosa en México. Recibimos a Luis Jesús Mejía Cruz con un fuerte aplauso. Estará Rachmaninov, estudio opus 39, número 5, así como también Cartas con poemas 4, Carolina, andante, expresivo y movido. Le agradecemos a Luis Jesús Mejía Cruz, estudiante de la Escuela de Música de la Universidad Nacional, esta actividad cultural. Vamos a dar inicio a la conferencia inaugural. No sin antes, debemos de despedir al doctor Jorge Herrera Murillo, vicerrector de investigación de nuestra universidad, quien nos honró con su presencia esta noche. El señor vicerrector debe de retirarse para seguir con el cumplimiento de las labores propias de su función. Lo despedimos con un fuerte aplauso. Buenas noches. Para la lección inaugural queremos avisarles que estarán pasando los compañeros edecanes con papelitos para las personas que quieran formular preguntas. Entonces, durante la presentación pueden ir preparando sus preguntas. Ya casi al final de la conferencia se van a recoger las preguntas. El moderador va a ser el señor director, don Marco Vinicio Méndez Coto. El conferencista invitado es el señor Lorenzo Peregrini. Don Lorenzo es profesor de Economía del Ambiente y el Desarrollo en el Instituto Internacional de Estudios Sociales de la Universidad Erasmus de Rotterdam en La Haya, Países Bajos, y profesor adjunto de la Universidad San Francisco de Quito, Ecuador. Recibió su doctorado en la Universidad Libre de Ámsterdam y su maestría la realizó en Economía Ambiental por la Universidad de Ancona. Sus intereses de investigación incluyen el impacto socioambiental de las industrias extractivas, justicia ambiental, evaluación de impacto, instituciones y corrupción. Sus publicaciones más recientes han aparecido en Geoforum, World Development, The Extractive Industry and Society, Capitalism, Nature, Socialism and Conservation Letters. Asimismo, tiene experiencia de investigación en países como Bután, Bolivia, Ecuador, India, Italia, Nicaragua, Pakistán, Perú, Ruanda y Vietnam. Está a cargo de cursos sobre metodologías de la investigación, economías del desarrollo, teorías del desarrollo, desarrollo sostenible y ecología económica. Actualmente, el doctor Peregrini colidera como investigador en el proyecto All Eyes on the Amazon, proyecto de Givos Greenpeace, en su componente de conocimiento y evaluación de impacto. Con ustedes, el doctor Lorenzo Peregrini y la conferencia Living Fossil Fuels in the Ground, an obvious, absurdly difficult, but not impossible proposal.
Academic authorities, Your Excellency, Ambassador Colella, colleagues, students, I'm very happy to be here in Costa Rica, almost after 20 years, here at the Universidad Nacional for the first time. It's really fantastic to be here. I'm very glad for the invitation. Thank you so much. And I am Lorenzo Pellegrini. I'm professor of economics of environment and development. So my background is in economics, but as you will see, I'm a little bit of an odd economist. I'm a little bit, you would say, a heterodox economist. So while normally we think in economics that there is the market, there is the economy, and then there are some adjustments that have to be made in terms of internalizing externalities. So we should also take into consideration the environment. In ecological economics and in political ecology, we start from the environment and we consider that the environment puts serious constraints on what the economy should and can do. And today we will talk about one of these constraints, the constraint of climate change. We have heard already, and I thank my colleagues for the kind words of introduction. We have heard a lot already tonight about climate change. I'm going to give you a little bit a different story here. We have heard, for example, that Costa Rica is a great example because your energy system is based on renewable energy. And that's true, that's great. But then it looks at climate change by looking at how much we consume and produce fossil fuels and how much we don't consume them, and then how much we produce greenhouse gases as a consequence. I will look at the flip side of the coin, and I would say that Costa Rica is a great country in terms of environmental policy because it has a moratorium in place about the extraction of fossil fuels. And that's what we are going to talk about today, leaving fossil fuels in the ground. An obvious, absurdly difficult, but not impossible proposal. That's my hypothesis. It's already there in the title. Let's see if I manage to convince you. First of all, I'll tell you what supply-side climate policies are and why we should care about them, and then I will explore a little bit how we could put such policies in place. And we start from here. These are global greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 to 2018. Here, let's look at the last, let's say, 20 years, to keep it short, from 2000 onwards. Do we see the effects of the Kyoto Protocol? Do we see the Paris Agreement? What we see here is that there is only one point when this curve declines a little bit. So on the vertical axis, of course, there are the gigatons of greenhouse gases that we are producing, CO2. And then on the horizontal axis, we have the years. What we see here is that greenhouse gas emissions year by year are increasing, with one exception, and this is 2008. It's a year of the great financial crisis. It's not something driven by any of the environmental policies regarding climate change. It's about an economic crisis. I didn't have data for 2019, 2020. You would also see an inflection there. Is that because of climate policies? No, of course, it's because of COVID. So we had crisis that led to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and then, as we know, 2022, greenhouse gas emissions rebound and start to increase again. 2009, 2010, after the great financial crisis, greenhouse gas emissions start to pick up again. We have a problem here. I'm not going to ask you to remember many numbers. Just remember, we are emitting more than 44 gigatons or billion tons of CO2 per year. Remember this, 44. And clearly, we are not on track here. Eh? So not only we are emitting too much, year by year, we emit more. Why do we emit? Where is the source of the problem? We are in Costa Rica, again, a good example of a country that managed to deal with the problem of, with several environmental problems. Two of these are deforestation and forest degradation. This is globally the source of approximately 18% greenhouse gases every year. But you see the elephant in the room there, the red part of the pie. This is energy. It's more than 73% of the global emissions. They are related to energy, and this essentially means fossil fuels. let's remember this. When we talk about the problem of climate change, mostly we are talking about the problem of combustion of fossil fuels. We extract fossil fuels and we burn them for energy, energy for electricity, transportation, heating. And this is by and large the main cause of greenhouse gas emissions. All the policies that we have, as I was saying already at the beginning, in dealing with climate change, they originate in the Framework Convention on Climate Change of the United Nations. They deal with consumption of fossil fuels, consumption that generates emissions. Here I want to focus on the production of fossil fuels. And this is another look at this. Here you can see indeed the 2008 crisis, and you can see also the crisis related to COVID. These are annual CO2 emissions from fossil fuels by world region. They basically amount to a little more than 35 billion tons per year, now in 2020. And this is what we should do in the future, according to the International Energy Agency, in the roadmap to net zero emissions, to stay on track to reduce the likelihood that we will increase the temperature by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius on the average. I mean, it's a complex graph, but basically it says, you see there new fields, the dark green part of the bar. Look at 2031, 2040. How much investment can we put into new fields of oil in the next decade? Zero. There is nothing dark green there. Let's look at the picture for gas, 2031, 2040, investment in natural gas in new fields, zero. There is no dark green. This is what a very conservative international body that specializes on energy says in terms of what we should do in terms of investment in exploration of and establishment of new oil and gas fields. And at the same time, of course, what do we have? Multinational fossil fuel companies that are investing in the hundreds of billions of euros or dollars precisely to explore and develop new oil, gas, and even coal fields. Now, I want to mention this, the carbon budget. The global temperature rises in a near linear relationship with the concentration of greenhouse gases, of CO2, in the atmosphere. Okay? The remaining carbon budget is the total amount of CO2 emissions that should not be exceeded to limit average global warming to the desired temperature. And for a 50% probability of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius if compared to pre-industrial times, the remaining carbon budget from 2020 onwards has been estimated at 440 gigatons. You remember I asked you to remember for this presentation one number, and that was 44 gigatons. We have 10 years, and we start counting in 2020. Okay? There are 7 years left. This is how serious this is. And this is, of course, for some people, a source of despair, and I hope for even more people, a source of rage and action. Okay, these are examples of carbon bombs, so huge investments. Each of these would produce more than 1 gigaton of CO2. each one of these. It's a fantastic paper by Kunet and others in Nature Communications from 2022. And I am saying this, of course, I like to be provocative, and I've been bad-mouthing fossil fuel companies now for the best part of my career, if not my life. But this is becoming common knowledge. Antonio Gutierrez, the General Secretary of the United Nations, said that climate activists are sometimes portrayed as dangerous radicals, but the truly dangerous radicals are the countries that are increasing production of fossil fuels. Investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness. I totally agree, of course, with Gutierrez, only I would stress that it's also fossil fuel companies that do this. It's not only countries. So there is a blame that should be shared there. So it's fantastic. Antonio Gutierrez says this in 2022, and just 1 year before him, 101 Nobel Prizes signed a letter asking countries to join a non-proliferation, a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So it's an idea that has been gaining ground also in academia, at least in terms of Nobel Prizes. Of course, here there is a picture of the Dalai Lama, but these were Nobel Prizes not only in peace, but also in all sorts of sciences. And we can look back in time, of course. There was a child in 2019 who said exactly the same. We weren't very good at listening, but she was very clear: keep fossil fuels in the ground. And even before that, in fact, this is the idea of keeping fossil fuels in the ground. It's something that comes from the Global South. It's an idea that starts in Nigeria with Nimo Bassey of Environment Rights Action, that in 2007 puts forward to the Nigerian government a concrete policy proposal to leave fossil fuels in the ground. It's an idea that travels through the Global South. It's picked up again by President Rafael Correa in Ecuador with the Yasuni ITT proposal, a proposal to leave an area with uncontacted, with people in voluntary isolation, indigenous people in voluntary isolation in the Ecuadorian Amazon aside, leave it unexplored for oil, and at the same time asking the international community to contribute financially to the coffers of the Ecuadorian state in exchange for the protection of this area. Unfortunately, it's an idea that didn't work out for many reasons, but it's an idea that is still there in the international community, and I think it definitely deserves to be revived. Okay, we want to stop the flow. Okay, we agree with Gutierrez, with Bassey, with Nimo Bassey, with Greta Thunberg. How can we stop the flow? I mean, I'm an economist, so I put economic instruments first. And there are so many economic instruments that you can use. You can use taxes, of course. You can use taxes and quota, tradable permits. Or you could have a regulation regarding moratoria or limitations, for example, in the construction of fossil fuel infrastructure. Or you could have hybrid systems, maybe akin to the regulation of tobacco. How do we deal with tobacco consumption? How do we discourage it? On the one hand, we have economic interests. Most countries tax tobacco products very heavily, and at the same time, we have regulations. You cannot smoke under certain ages. You cannot smoke in certain places, and you could do exactly something similar with fossil fuels. You cannot extract fossil fuels from biodiversity hotspots, like the Ecuadorian Amazon, and not only there. You cannot construct new infrastructure or explore for new fields, and at the same time, the oil that you, and the gas and the coal that you still extract, you should pay heavy taxes on it. But I was telling you that most of the policies that have been explored, they deal with the demand. of fossil fuels rather than the supply of fossil fuels. So why should we now all of a sudden start to focus on the supply of fossil fuels? Well, there are tremendous possibilities to generate synergies with demand policies. So in fact, supply side policy and demand policies for fossil fuels, they're not an alternative one to the other, but they compound each other and strengthen each other. Supply side policies, so policies to leave fossil fuels underground, they are very concrete and they have a politically galvanizing effect. So in fact, when we see social movements in many countries arising, like the movement against oil extraction here in Costa Rica, they have very often specific extraction sites in mind. Very rarely you see such powerful groups, social movements that arise to diminish the consumption of fossil fuels. It's very much about hotspots, places where fossil fuels are going to be extracted, places where pipelines are being constructed, are planned to be constructed. And these politically galvanizing initiatives also can have an effect on norms, stigmatizing international norms, stigmatizing policies that allow, that foster even, of course, the extraction of fossil fuels. And then on the contrary of demand-side policies, supply-side policies only need to be agreed by fossil fuel producers. We are all, of course, all countries are consumers of fossil fuels, but countries that supply fossil fuels to the international market are just a few, especially if you consider substantial producers. They are also easier to monitor. It's easier to see where new oil fields are being constructed, cases where new infrastructure is being built, and much less easy is to see how many greenhouse gases, net greenhouse gases emissions are being emitted. It solves or ameliorates at least the green paradox. The green paradox is this idea, this phenomenon that has been hypothesized where countries that produce fossil fuels have an incentive to produce more fossil fuels, the more demand declines. Why is that? If there are demand policies that are effective and you are a country that has large reserves of fossil fuels, you try to extract them and sell them before the prices of fossil fuels decline because of declined demand. So in fact, it's a paradox. If you only apply demand policies, you might induce countries to try to sell their fossil fuels faster. And then you anticipate greenhouse gas emissions rather than reduce them. It acts as an insurance. If demand policies fail, you still have the other set of policies. And then it can signal commitment also in relation to this insurance effect, and that means that investors might be less likely to invest in funding initiatives that lock the economy in the consumption and in the production of fossil fuels. It can drive technological choices, and this in turn can contribute to avoid so-called stranded assets. So stranded assets are these investments that if we will take the carbon budget serious are not gonna pan out in terms of production of fossil fuels. Okay, and in that case, by diminishing investment, also it diminishes the power of vested interests who have all the interest indeed to battle against climate policies. And it can create collateral benefits. There are two collateral benefits that I want to mention here. One is the resource curse. The resource curse is this apparent paradoxical relationship between the wealth of nations in terms of natural resources and the dismal socio-developmental performance that there is in most cases. So there is this paradox that the more the country is rich of natural resources, the least developed it tends to be. I mean, we can look at this in many different ways. We can look globally. Of course, the last 70 years, the big boom of Asia, these are all countries that are very poor in endowments of natural resources. Or we could look regionally, right? We are in Latin America. The country that is best endowed with natural resources is Bolivia. And definitely it's not the country that is developing the best in the continent. And at the same time, there are socio-environmental liabilities associated with the extraction of fossil fuels. So again, the movement here in Costa Rica against the extraction of oil was concerned not primarily with climate change, but the local impacts of fossil fuel extraction. And we have plenty of evidence of this. Epidemiological studies that show higher morbidity and mortality rates in populations that live in the proximity of fossil fuel operations. And we have plenty of evidence of the impact of fossil fuel operations in, for example, biodiversity, in terms of biodiversity. So environmental quality that then affects also human welfare. Now, if we think, I'm telling you we should keep really a large share, most of the fossil fuels that we have under the ground. How are we gonna decide which fossil fuels precisely can be extracted and which ones have to be left underground? Well, one way to look at this is to distribute these resources according to the principle of ecological depth. So here we have a graph on who has contributed the most to global CO2 emissions. Of course, the United States stand out with approximately 25% of cumulative emissions emitted just by a single country. And then we have all the rest of the countries here. The European Union at 28 membership, 22%, etc. So how can we use this ecological depth, the fact that a global good has been consumed mostly by a few countries at the damage of the rest of the countries that don't have space anymore to emit greenhouse gases? Well, we could assign, of course, rights to extract, but maybe this is not the right question. What we could assign are responsibilities in terms of paying for adaptation to climate change, because climate change is a reality. It has effects already. We will have to deal with them. And then also funding for the transition to renewables to be allocated based on the cumulative emissions that took place already in the past. And then there is the issue of compensation that should also be assigned in terms of, on the basis of past cumulative emissions. Compensation is the idea that countries that forgo their right to extract fossil fuels are entitled to compensation. And the question immediately is, can we afford to compensate countries for not extracting their fossil fuels? And again, also in this case, being a critical social scientist, I like to tilt the question around, and I would ask the question, can we afford not to do it? Can we ask countries who have immense wealth in their soil to forgo the extraction and the generation of that wealth without any compensation? And here we have an example, of course, Congo to auction land to oil companies. These are international news from last year, October 2022. Our priority is not to save the country. I mean, Congo has huge reserves of fossil fuels. They overlap with very important natural resources in terms of wetlands, biodiversity, hotspots, tropical forests. And they say, well, our priority is not to save the environment. It's not to do climate policies. It's to develop. We need the resources. And I think it's hard from the international perspective to claim that Congo has no right to its resources unless we are willing to compensate Congo for foregoing extraction. And in fact, we did a back-of-the-envelope calculation together with my colleagues Martí Horta Martínez and Murat Artsel. We took the compensation that was implied by the Yasuni ITT initiative. We looked at how much fossil fuel oil resources we have underground, and we came up with the total compensation for leaving oil and gas underground of a staggering $5.4 trillion. So this is, of course, a huge amount of funds. But I like this quote from John Maynard Keynes: anything we can actually do, we can afford. So these are huge figures, $5.4 trillion US dollars. The US between 2001 and 2020 spent on war abroad $10 trillion. The rescue packages for COVID only in Europe and in the United States exceed the $20 trillion in the last couple of years. Yeah? So if we are serious that the climate change crisis is just as serious as the COVID pandemic, we have indeed a possibility we can afford also to have instruments for compensation of about leaving fossil fuels on the ground. And I'm telling you why we should do it. I'm hinting out at the benefits, how we could do it, the issue of compensation. And in fact, there are policy initiatives that are shaping up. This was really, maybe 5 years ago, or even in 2019, when Greta Thunberg started to say, let's leave fossil fuels underground, in terms of policy making, it sounded like an extravagant idea. In fact, I know this because I wrote some papers and I had a tough time to publish them before 2019, because the referees would say, why should we look at supply side if we have all the policies that are based on demand? Nobody will ever accept to leave their fossil fuels underground. But this evades the question. The question is, can we have fossil fuels that are coming off the ground and stay within the carbon budget? And the answer is no. So, Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, adopted by a number of subnational institutions, like even states in the United States, cities, and now also a couple of countries. The BOGA, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, with 2 founding members, Costa Rica and Denmark, and now a number of other members. The Powering Past Coal Alliance, and then individual countries that had moratoria and bans. Again, the case of Costa Rica, but not only. The case for new oil and gas exploration in France, the moratoria in New Zealand. A number of countries are coming up with moratoria and bans on new extraction or expansion of existing activities. Of course, I'm forgetting an important example, which is the one of Colombia. New President Petro is very much in favor of having a ban in place on new extraction, exploration projects. And then, of course, there are steps forward and steps backwards. So these policy initiatives are great. Unfortunately, I come from a country that had a temporary moratorium in place on new oil projects, and the moratoria elapsed, and now there is again the opening in Italy of new projects, also possibly closer to the coastline, so also offshore projects. Okay, conclusions, or I should have written maybe conclusions question mark. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of fossil fuels. Here, I'm paraphrasing Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek talking about the end of capitalism. And I think the challenge is just as large. But it's something that we have to do. We have to start to imagine, to debate, to discuss how we can have a world that is not based on fossil fuels, and a global economy that is not based on fossil fuel. And fossil fuel realism discourages us from thinking and articulating alternatives to fossil fuel capitalism. Fossil fuel played a defining role in the Industrial Revolution. In fact, in a way you could say, what is the Industrial Revolution? It's the exploitation of the energy embedded in coal, leading to the advance of real existing capitalism. And here, of course, I'm citing Mark Fisher as well. Is it possible to have renewable varieties of capitalism? So to have capitalism that departs from its origin and develops into something different because of the exploitation of renewable energy? I definitely think it is possible. I don't think there is anything implicit in capitalism that doesn't allow us to exploit renewable energy as a main source of energy. And of course, there are powerful forces in capitalism that don't like this. And then we can think about also more radical alternatives, acknowledging limits and organizing social mechanisms to satisfy basic socio-environmental rights. And then there is maybe here something for us, for academics, who need to reach out outside academia, of course, to the policymaking world, but also to the world of social movements, engaging with social movements, studying corporate social irresponsibility, and especially the irresponsibility of fossil fuel producers, and making it more likely that fossil fuel companies are held accountable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, for this very interesting conference. We have several questions from our students, so we're going to work maybe with a block of 3 questions, and then you can reply because we have like 9, and all of these are very interesting to take into account.
Sorry, Marco, a question. How much time do I have? Because I can talk forever, but there are limits. I wouldn't like to over...
20 minutes?
20 minutes,
maybe?
okay.
It's okay. So we have, I will read 3 of them, and you can reply. The first one, is the energy transition dirtier than we think? It's a question. The other, how to convince developing countries about leaving fossil fuels on the ground? And if climate policies have been failing for more than 27 years, what are we missing?
No. Okay. Thank you very much, and I can take questions also in Spanish, so I'm too shy to speak Spanish on with such a large and esteemed audience, but I can take questions in Spanish, of course. So if somebody was shy to ask questions in writing because of language barriers, I'm happy to take the questions in Spanish as well. So the energy transition. The energy transition is a transition in terms of energy sources, of course, and we are being bombarded by the fact that the transition itself requires mineral, requires natural resources, requires especially the results of metallic and non-metallic mining. Okay? I think in a way it's very instrumental to emphasize so much these needs, because if you look at the volumes, just the sheer volumes of fossil fuels that we consume every year, and we compare this to the material requirements that we need for the transition, we see that we are just on a different scale, where the transition is in fact much less demanding. And we have experience of fighting bottlenecks. Just like last year, of course, cobalt was becoming very, very expensive, and this year, just the price just crashed. I think that's something that the global economy is very good at doing. One essential difference that we have between the fossil fuels and renewable energy is that renewable energy can really adapt and change because it's based on technology. It's not based on very specific sources of energy. Okay? Coal has been with us for 270 years, more or less, and we never really reduced the consumption of coal. We have been increasing it. Are we gonna use lithium batteries in 250 years from now? No. No way. In fact, if it's true that there is a bottleneck with lithium, we will find some other way to store energy. We will use hydrogen and fuel cells rather than lithium. And we have done this already with material magnets based on rare earths that were absolutely necessary for windmills, and we just replaced them with some other type of magnets, and apparently they were not a necessity. So here we are talking about a transition away from a source of energy into technologies. And technologies can develop really, really fast. This said, so I like to be contrarian, I started like this. This said, of course, there are needs for mining of rare earths, lithium, etc. And these will have to be dealt with. Hopefully, okay, these are smaller quantities that need to be extracted if compared to fossil fuels. This can be dealt in a better way than what we did with fossil fuels. And I think something I like to stress is that an energy transition can also be a transition to smaller demand. I think it's impossible to imagine a transition where all the citizens, all the global citizens will consume as much as American citizens. But already, if you look at rich countries, there is such an incredible divergence in consumption. European citizens consume less than 1/3 than American citizens, for example. And the Japanese citizens somewhere in between. Can you say that European citizens are energy poor? I don't think so. And of course, European citizens themselves should look elsewhere and think about how reducing their consumption. So I think here we have a transition where it's not only a matter of technologies, it's also a matter of energy systems in terms of how much we consume. Okay, then the second question was about developing countries and fossil fuels. How can we convince developing countries to produce less fossil fuels? Compensation, compensation, compensation. Okay? It's really unfair to us developing countries not to extract fossil fuels unless the global community is willing to foot the bill. There is no moral principle that can justify this. I am very adamant. And absolutely, the international community, if it wants, it can do amazing stuff from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Of course, it's based on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in the height of the Cold War between the East and the West, the communist world and the capitalist world. Countries could come together, led by the United States of America and the USSR. They could find an agreement on reducing the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The Montreal Protocol, indeed the reactions we had to the pandemic at the European Union, it was impossible to put together big packages, rescue packages, etc. And then all of a sudden there was a pandemic striking all European countries, and all of a sudden the EU could put its act together and really react very strongly. This is that kind of challenge. We can definitely afford it. Everything we can do, we can afford, as Keynes said. And then the climate policies, yes, I think this was covered towards the end, talking about really the synergies. What stops the success of the climate policies is that the climate policies, as we know them, are half-hearted attempts, and at the same time are policies that look only at the demand side for fossil fuels. I think really need to get a new development where we start to look also at the supply side to strengthen the demand side policies. And of course, this is an international relations school. I will say something maybe not very diplomatic by saying that, of course, when you start to have to organize the most important meeting for demand side climate policies in the United Arab Emirates in 2023, I think there are good reasons also to think that we are not booking much success because there is no real intention to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, thank you, Professor. We have another batch of questions, and a couple of them are related to issues regarding international politics, and the other two are related to Costa Rica and considerations. So the first one, it says, African delegations and countries have been saying that 1.5 Celsius means no Africa, that the consequences would be huge for them. If we already know this, why do we keep 1.5 Celsius as a goal? And the other related to this is, why do you think the countries that exploit their fossil fuel resources and the big companies that are part of the fossil fuel capitalism do not see the crisis that will come in the long term? So I guess these two are kind of related. And the other ones are, can we consider cultural changes as one of the fundamental factors we must take into account consideration to prevent the use of fossil fuels? And in Spanish, para un país como Costa Rica, y considerando la urgencia del asunto, ¿qué considera más eficiente? ¿Políticas internas de moratorias o acelerar la estrategia externa de utilizar herramientas diplomáticas?
All right, thanks. 1.5 degree and what happens to the African countries? Why do we keep these objectives since what happens is already disastrous? Again, remember the 45 gigatons and the fact that we have 440. I mean, in fact, realistically, if we keep going like this, we are not even gonna meet the 1.5 degree. In fact, some people, some observers have been arguing that we should abandon the 1.3 and just focus on the 2 degrees Celsius. That gives us a much larger carbon budget, 3 times as large, or even, no, more than 3 times as large. And I would say we keep the 1.5 and we, again, get enraged if we exceed that carbon budget. And there will be impacts of climate change. Even if we stopped emissions entirely right now, there still are enough emissions in the global atmosphere, and we are going to see the effects of this. There are some countries, and I'm thinking, of course, about small islands, that will face these effects. There are countries in tropical arid areas that will be in deep problems, and there are countries affected, of course, also by volatile climate. and those will also be affected. I think that's also a matter of adaptation, okay? So much of the emphasis is on the mitigation of emissions, but of course we need a renewed interest and renewed initiatives also in terms of adaptation, especially for the countries that are less likely to be able to afford adaptation. And that includes, of course, most of sub-Saharan Africa. And then countries and companies, do they know that there is a crisis, and why don't they do something about it? Of course, we can go back to basic economic thinking in terms of free riding and the difficulty of collective action. We heard it at the beginning, 5% of global emissions come, and these are the demand side, but they come from Latin America. So even if Latin America stopped entirely its emissions, still 95% of the emissions would be there. So why should Latin America as a region do it? And even more, just Costa Rica, right? So if we go on a smaller scale. So I think that's why we need a global initiative. Okay, this is a problem that the global community is facing, and we need effective global initiatives. Cultural changes and fossil fuels, of course, the fight against fossil fuels goes also through cultural changes, but that's only a part of the story. So in a way, we emphasize the fact that it depends on us, and some things really depend on us. But not everything depends on us as consumers, as people with a specific culture. It depends on us also as citizens that then approach states, approach the international community to promote certain policies. Not all policies are conducive to the same cultural changes. Not all cultural changes are conducive to the same policies, and we work within certain structures, okay? I like to travel by train, and I used to be a big traveler by train. In Europe, most international connections have been shut, and now I take the plane more often. Is there a cultural change that I can undergo? No, I'm very upset about this. But as long as the trains are not there, I have no alternative. Okay? This is just one example of a structural constraint that you cannot deal with only with cultural change. Then my cultural change is to vote for parties, be part of movements that ask for the international trains to be back on track, as the slogan goes. Okay, so here you have an example of the limitations of cultural change. But I will not dismiss cultural change. I mean, of course, we need change within us that then spurs also action as citizens. In Costa Rica, the alternative between the moratorium or diplomacy, of course, you need both. You need to give an example. You need to be a leader, and it's great that it's a small country, middle income, great. It makes you even more of an important leader. I think Costa Rica, in a way, what is it doing here? Among other things, embarrassing Canada and Australia, just to mention two. And the United States, of course, big producers of fossil fuels who are much richer than Costa Rica. And still Costa Rica can afford not extracting fossil fuels. And then that you need to bring out also in terms of diplomacy. I think fantastic, the BOGA Alliance, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, and I think, yeah, I hope Costa Rica will hold strong both with the leadership and with the role it plays also in terms of international diplomacy here.
Well, thank you, Professor. And we're going to talk about the last batch to wrap up. And thank you very much for having this opportunity to talk with our students, and also to have the opportunity to have this conference in English. And well, as we know, these are a very innovative approach to international politics and have a very important impact on international trade. So it's a normal thing that we have skepticism in the auditorium. So a student asked that, being honest, how can we convince countries as the USA to agree and to really take actions on this approach? And the other one is related to who should dictate the new policies in case of a new supply chain.
Sorry, I didn't get the second question.
Who should dictate the new policies in case of a new supply chain?
Okay. Who should take the lead? Yeah. All right. How do we convince the United States to change its posture in terms of fossil fuel extraction and greenhouse gas emissions? This is a huge challenge. It's one of those questions in politics. And I will ask you, how did we change the international posture on slavery? How did women gain their rights to vote? It starts like a crazy idea. You mean all humans are born equal, including slaves, including people of color, including even women? And now it looks obvious. Of course, we are all born equal. And this is the kind of change we need in terms of fossil fuels, in terms of climate change. It's a huge challenge, but I believe in progress. I hope you will also believe in progress. I think we do progress. Societies, in certain respects, experience progress, and in others we don't. So let's make this an example of progress. And then who should take the lead? Everybody. Again, social movements, countries, academics. Academics, I emphasize this. I speak very often in scholarly activism fora. So I cooperate, of course, with social movements, with NGOs, and I think we all have a part to play, and we have to push the rest of society, the rest of the global community, to play its part. So who should take the lead? Everybody. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Marco, for chairing the session and for for giving me the questions, and see you in the next few days, maybe. Thanks.
Vamos a invitar a las autoridades de la mesa principal a pasar al frente para proceder con la entrega del certificado. Adelante. El señor director, don Marco Vinicio Méndez Coto, le hace entrega al señor Lorenzo Pellegrini de un certificado que dice así: Universidad Nacional, Conferencia Inaugural, Facultad de Ciencias Sociales, Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales, se complacen en otorgar el presente certificado de agradecimiento al señor Lorenzo Pellegrini por realizar la conferencia inaugural Living Fossil Fuels in the Ground, an obvious, absurdly difficult but not impossible proposal, Heredia, Costa Rica, 14 de marzo 2023. La doctora Marta Sánchez López, decana de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales, le hace entrega de un souvenir al doctor Lorenzo Peregrini. El souvenir con diseño típico costarricense evoca la carreta, el arte de la carreta típica, símbolo de el trabajo en Costa Rica. El señor director, don Marco Vinicio Méndez Coto, director de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales, le hace entrega del libro Las Relaciones Internacionales de Costa Rica, un vistazo en el Bicentenario. Muchas gracias, pueden tomar asiento. Señoras y señores, de esta forma hemos llegado al final del acto protocolario de la lección inaugural de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales 2023 en el marco de la celebración de los 50 años de la Universidad Nacional y en el marco también de la celebración de los 50 años de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales. Tengan todas y todos ustedes muy buenas noches.